the work that we're going to be doing this year, in the first half of the year, is trialling a model that was developed out of the earlier project, looking at working with computer games, thinking about games as both text and as action. And what Joe and I are going to do now is to just talk you through that model and then discuss some examples. The model, so when we were looking at planning for working with games as text, or working with computer games in the classroom, how do I do this? How do I get to the next screen? Our challenge was to develop a model for curriculum planning, pedagogy, that is curriculum planning, teaching, learning and analysis that addressed games as both text and action. So although when we started this project we were thinking about games primarily as examples of multimodal texts, it pretty quickly became clear that they were more than that, and they were different to that, and that they did work as texts in some ways, but in other ways that was a really incomplete and inadequate way to think about them. So a lot of our work in that previous project was to think about how to understand games and then how to make use of that understanding in the classroom. So our earlier project, Digital Literacy in the Digital Age of the 21st Century, Learning from Computer Games, which Joe and I were both involved with, and many of the Victorian schools were similarly involved. One of the Victorian schools was involved.
Yeah.
One Victorian school was involved. Okay, so one aim, as you can see, was to develop a model that people could use for planning, teaching and assessment using digital games to support literacy and learning. And we also wanted a model that would let us understand more about what kids were doing as they played games. So it was both about planning and doing work at school, and it was also about having a picture of what playing games outside of school involves. And the model came from two main sets of work. Partly it came from the reading and thinking that the team was doing in relation to new literacies, new media, learning and game studies. And part of it came from the work that the teachers we were working with were doing in school. Just as in this project, different members of the project team worked with different teachers, worked in different schools, and together the teachers and the students and the project person developed units that matched different classes, depending on where they were and what level they were at and so on. But because we were combining both the literacies area with also game studies, it meant that there were quite different perspectives and quite different ways of thinking about what games were. And when we began the project, we talked about computer games. But by the time we got very far into it, it was clear that computer games were only just a little bit of it. So by digital games we mean all of those forms, all of those examples, but there are other ones as well. Wii's, for example, PSPs and so on. So you can see there that in thinking about games as text, we were thinking about them as new cultural forms. In thinking about games as action, it was a lot about the interaction between players and the machine, that the players have to do something to make something happen.
And I think this was something that emerged as being really important to using games in the classroom as we went through the project. And also for us, or for me in particular, reading the games literature made me see the active aspect of the games and think about it like that, because in the beginning I'd been thinking about it more as a cultural artefact, as though it was a text, and then I realised throughout the project that the game itself really only exists in the gameplay, because the game itself is like a machine within which you have the experience of playing the game in multiple and different ways. So we tried to get that into the model.
So I'm going to talk a little while now just about the games as text side. So this was the idea of literacy as including traditional literacies, but also including multimodal and electronic forms. And in the national curriculum for English, there's a lot now there's a lot of mention anyway about digital multimodal, and not just in English either. But what that means and how to do it is something we're still working out really. But as with all literacy work, and I guess in most subjects too, we're trying to encourage kids to become capable and critical and creative, in this instance users and producers of digital texts. So when we started to think about the text dimension of thinking about games, we thought we came up with 4 main dimensions. And this in a way is parallel to earlier work that's been done in English in particular and in literacy, where you're thinking about learning language, learning through language and learning about language. So this was learning through games, learning about games and learning games, I guess. So we, after many attempts and experiments with how to visually represent the model, we came up with this notion of 2 circles that kind of interrelated. So in each of these sectors we've got one of the dimensions of the games as text. So oops, I lost it. So that knowledge about games section includes things like this. So very literary, when I look at it now, very literary set of perspectives, maybe filmic, but very much trying to look at them as cultural forms, but as it appears to me now, coming from a kind of a very literacy narrative-based perspective. And it may be that is something that we work with. If you're doing work with games that are particularly narrative, for example, or if you're coming from a much stronger background from somewhere else, this may be too constricting. But what we were after there was what kind of objects are games and what kinds of stories do they tell and what kind of values do they carry and how do they call on what you already know about stories like this or games like this. How does playing a game, how do games organise knowledge?
And one of the things we found throughout the project was that the students we were working with had a strong sense of bringing knowledge from previous games and gaming experiences into the work that they were doing at the time. So, so part of this was about our understanding of what games were, but also we did notice that the students themselves had a really strong sense of what knowledge they had, and they were using and drawing upon this knowledge in all different kinds of ways throughout the project.
So in a way, this is in as much as this one has been a focus on games as a form, particularly kind of a narrative form, the next box was much more to do with seeing games as existing in a much bigger context. It wasn't just the game, there's a whole lot more things that affect the experience of play and the nature of games and the nature of kids' involvement. And that first one, situated context, that where you're playing affects how you play, has tremendous implications for how we think about games. And something that's really, really important, one of the main reasons why people got excited, there are a number of reasons why people got excited about working with games in schools, I think. One of them was because when they looked at what happened outside of school, they looked how absolutely engrossed kids became with games and how important games were in kids' lives, and they coupled that with the kind of quite sophisticated understandings that games make possible, that they thought, terrific, we'll put this in school, and all that good stuff that happens at home or in, at the local, internet cafe or whatever, we'll reproduce it in school. And of course, context changes things tremendously. Other contexts change things tremendously too. If you're playing by yourself, that might be different from playing at a friend's place down the street. But this emphasis on situation and context is something that has really been important in literacy and in literacy work forever, really. But it's important here too. This also gives us the chance to say, this is one example where something that appears in one layer also appears in the other layer. And of course, situation affects how you play and affects the actions you take. So this is one example of something that crosses across both of them. There's a few other things there that emerged during the course of the study, which aren't quite so kind of obvious. That next one, the notion of paratexts. That was something that, particularly for some members of the team and for some teachers, became really, really interesting and important. And that's to do with the idea that it's not just the game itself, the game is linked to a whole lot of other related paratext. So paratext made by others might be kind of like trailers and promos made by the games company before it comes, or reviews online. Or it might be things that you made or other people made. So it might be a little YouTube clip that somebody's made of themselves playing whatever it is. Or it might be, in class, it might be a poster that you made about the game, or it might be a bit of machinima that you made about the game. So paratext is like the texts that are related to the game, specifically related to the game, either made by yourself and other players, or generated for commercial reasons by others. The woman who came up with this term in this context, this is an old term that gets used in literary theory, but the woman who came up with this, Mia Consalvo, talks about paratext as the texts that spring up like mushrooms around the game. A global context of play, and the idea of games as part of, that phrase that got a very 70s ring, really, the military entertainment complex. But that's really saying, well, games are part of a much bigger industry, a much bigger group. There's huge amounts of commercial interest in games, and there are endless numbers of figures about, games exceeding box office, for Hollywood blockbusters. And there's also a massive investment in the military for the capacity of games to kind of train and simulation and so on. The other thing that's not perhaps quite so self-evident is the idea of gaming capital. And again, this is kind of an idea from other writers and other thinking about how people gain status in society, really. And the argument here is that if you're really good at games, that this gives you authority. And as we found in our project, it gives you authority in the online world, but it also gives you authority in the offline world, because of course the boundaries between those things are not hard and fast. So the next one is me as games player, which is likely meant to be a focus on me. And if I think about that in relation to English, that's about things like how am I positioned by this text in a way, or how do I interpret the people I'm playing with, or how do they interpret me? But also, so that's the English literacy side. But if you think about it in terms of the action side, it's also that you're interacting with other people, and you're creating relationships online, you're presenting yourself as a certain kind of person. About that one, Jo?
Well, it's also about, it's the whole identity strand as well, which we spend a lot of time looking at, like how do young people construct their identities as games players, and how are they constructed in various ways. So if you have a look at the slide, one of the things that we mapped out was that sometimes you're physically present with the people that you're playing with, and quite often a lot of the rhetoric around danger, games are making everyone isolated, is actually not played out all the time, because often people share a console or they'll share a computer to play. Often they're playing with people who they're in the same room with, but sometimes they are playing, they're physically absent. We found a lot of the adolescents were playing games on the internet with people they actually knew, so they're friends from school, as well as people that they don't know. And so these sorts of things about who's present, who's absent, who's known, who's unknown, is actually much more complex than often, if you just read the media, you would have a feeling that things were. So that was a really interesting aspect that I think is really interesting for us to all look at in our classrooms as well. What are the actual playing practices? I think they change a lot over time, with each new set of gaming materials people are using.
And the fourth one was learning through games, which is really basically focusing on learning in the curriculum areas. And some of that was with what gets called serious games, but it was, people were using, in our project and in the other project, people were using free-to-air games, free to download games, and commercial games. So, but that's really where your games are being used to kind of support learning in curriculum areas. And we saw this area was also about becoming more aware of the kind of your learning processes. So learning about learning comes in there, and so does the critical literacy. So those four quadrants and we'll talk about this again in a minute, it's not necessary in your work to do everything, but we'd hope that at least in one of those quadrants, there'd be one of those areas at least that you'd be able to include in your curriculum planning. And what we found was usually there was a mixture of things, but some things were more prominent than others. So to go on to the games as action model, the games as action layer, and you can see there it's got 3 areas: design, situations, and action. So situations, it's not doing it, Joe.
I think it's just...
Okay. So, this is, again, we mentioned this in a different way in the games as text section, but here it's looking actually more about the kind of the practical real world side of it. So when you're playing perhaps with other players, or you might be playing with just a single player game. If you're playing with other players, it might be people that you know, it might be people you don't know, it might be people that you're sitting next to, it might be people in another school somewhere, or it might be people in another house or another cafe. You may also be playing with non-player characters. Most games have got non-player characters in them, so you might be playing against the machine effectively. The technologies that you're using, or the devices that you're using, shape what it is that you're playing. So if you're playing something on a Wii, that's different than if you're playing something on a phone. We talked about the paratext that surround the games, and that also is, in a way, a version of a situation. And then things like context and status that your status in one context shapes your status in another. The second one is design, and we know from the kind of literacy field that design cuts both ways, and people often use the term design instead of literacy to talk about the ways in which people make meaning using not just words but images and music and sound and all those things.
And actually the list that's on this slide is really just a very short list of a huge range of design elements that people are using while they're gaming. These are just some that are kind of our examples, but there are many, many more aspects of this.
And the third dimension is actions one. Again, we've talked some of about some of this before, but you're playing. You have to do something to make something happen. And that last thing there about the importance of space. So when we put these together in outline, we get these 2 wheels, and we think people should have a copy of. We made a little cardboard model of the wheels, and we'll bring some more with us when we see you. But that's this little model. The idea really is that when you're planning your unit, when you're looking at what kids are doing, when you're thinking about assessment, that you draw on at least something from each of these 2 layers. And this very natty dynamic, which we're really excited about, used to be excited about and now getting a little weary of, is just to show that these layers, it's all fluid really, and you don't have to go to any particular combination. And there are limitations to the model, but it's quite fun. Okay, so what we're asking you to do in your work this term is to try the model out, to include at least one dimension from each layer, and to think about in relation to your planning, your teaching, the learning the kids are doing, and the assessment. And you remember that we're across the project, people are doing things where they're using games in relation to curriculum areas and learning through games. The second one is to do with analysing games and how games might work as text or how they might work as cultural forms. And the third one is making games. And we're interested in questions like what works with this model, what doesn't work, what else needs to be taken into account. Because this model grew out of the work teachers did last time and the work we were doing last time. But this is the first time really it's been tried out beyond that group, and we really very much value the kind of input and insights that you can give us. In your role as co-researchers with us, we're hoping that you'll be able to collect some materials, some data, So we'll be looking, asking you to collect and looking for things like lesson plans, resources, materials and so on, links to websites and whatever that you might use, examples of student work. We'll probably interview you, we'll probably interview your students, and we may also be either ourselves asking for photos and videos or asking you to collect those things. And our ethics approvals provide for that. But if we're going to be doing videos, we'd of course talk with you about what's going to work the best in that context. So in a minute we're going to talk about some examples, but I'll just finish off by showing the elaborated version of the model. So this is our very beautiful model, this is the print version. You have the print version of this. And as I said, you don't have to do everything on it, but that what's in each segment gives you an idea of what sorts of things might be in there. I might stop showing. You can talk about some examples.
So in a way, I feel like I'm doing an advertisement from the book we produced from our last project, because really this book has got like a series of examples that you might look to. If you are thinking about investigating the model more deeply, the second chapter is a whole paper about the model, and it explains what Catherine's talked about today in a lot more detail. And then the whole first section of the book is a series of case studies that teachers we worked with last time produced. And they cover sort of the range of things that we're looking at in this project. So there are some examples of people making games, people using games as texts, and also, people investigating games and that kind of thing. One of the things I think that Catherine mentioned that's really important to stress is that we developed the model in line with these teachers cooperating as we were doing the work that's represented in these chapters. And so at that time, people weren't planning from the model. It kind of emerged out of this work as like an agreed set of ideas that we all felt pertained to the work that we'd already done. So what we're doing now is really quite different to that, because we're starting with this model and then we're going to critique it and we're going to investigate, does it really work? Is it, what would need to change to make it more valuable for teachers? What ways can we develop it further? Or is it that we should simplify it? Is it too complicated? And if we have a look, I have to put my glasses on to have a look at this, but if we have a look, chapter 3 really is a good example of people looking at computer games as texts. And at the end of the chapter, there's a section looking at which aspects of the model we used in this particular chapter. The fourth chapter 4 is people using drama, so exploring virtual worlds and exploring some of the cultural capital around computer games in their exploration. And if you have a look through, you'll see that chapter 7 is about making games, and chapter 8 has a series of different kinds of activities where it does really all of the 3 elements, I think, of what we're doing in this project. But all of these chapters are written by the teachers or us in consultation with the teachers, and the way that the model's been used in them is quite interesting. And I think, a lot of the work we did last year is really interesting to think about in terms of this model. I was really impressed with, some of the textile work that some of the teachers were doing up in Queensland, and I was thinking, it had a lot of complexity in the way people were thinking about games as texts, and so it would be interesting for some of those teachers to go back and revisit it, think about this model and how they might describe their work. And some of the Victorian teachers had done, and Michael's group in Queensland as well, working with the Minecraft server. And that's a really interesting example, or set of examples, because it's making a game, but it's really creating an environment. And so how would creating an environment fit into this model, you know, if we were looking at this model as a planning thing. So I think there's a lot of really rich work that happened last year that it would be really interesting to kind of use the model to explore and interrogate a little bit more fully.
I should say too that like Joe, I feel like, you know, we're just a walking advertisement for the book.
Yeah.
The reason we wanted to give it to you really was
free.
really wanted to give it to you was partly because it's got a nice explanation of what that model is, but also because we thought that you might find it interesting or give you some ideas to see what other teachers have done. But we don't anticipate anybody will read it cover to cover, much as we would like. We would like that. So it's really, this is what a description of the model and some ideas and examples from other people. But as Joe said, you know, this was done a few years ago. We love what people did then, but there was a different starting point. And in this project, we're well underway with a whole range of new great stuff. And, hope to explore more. Yeah.